Welcome to Sign Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sign Facts and step beyond the screen. The story picks up with Nick, an ambitious prosecutor who's built his career on an eye-popping conviction rate somewhere around 96%. He's laser-focused on protecting that number, and he makes no secret of it with his team. He doesn't want cases that could put a dent in his win record. If a prosecution feels shaky, Nick would rather sidestep the risk than gamble on a public loss. Not long after, a colleague pulls him aside about Clyde's case, and the update isn't good. A judge has just thrown out crucial DNA evidence from the crime scene, and without it, the case against the two suspects has taken a serious hit. Nick starts running the numbers in his head almost immediately. Instead of rolling the dice on a trial that could let both men go free, he opts to cut a plea deal. He frames it as just another example of a justice system that's far from perfect, but in his mind, walking away with one conviction beats risking everything and getting nothing. When Clyde shows up to meet with him, he brings notes and information he's convinced will help strengthen the case. He's still holding on to the hope that the man who destroyed his family will actually pay for it. Nick barely glances at what Clyde's prepared before dropping the real news. Darby has agreed to testify against Rupert. Under the deal, Rupert will be painted as the ringleader and sentenced to death, while Darby, in exchange for flipping, walks away with a dramatically lighter sentence, possibly as little as 5 years. For Clyde, this is almost impossible to swallow. He's already lost his wife and daughter, and now he's being told that one of the men responsible could be back on the streets in just a few years. He pleads with Nick to reject the deal, insisting both men deserve to answer for what happened in his home. But Nick's mind is made up. He explains that courts don't run on what prosecutors personally believe, they run on what can be proven with admissible evidence. To him, sending Rupert to death row while locking in a conviction against Darby still counts as a win. To Clyde, calling that a victory feels like an insult. The case plays out in court exactly the way Nick planned. Rupert is cast as the more culpable of the two, while Darby benefits from his cooperation. Throughout it all, Darby shows almost no remorse. At one point he even shoots Nick a smug look, as if he knows exactly how well the system has worked out for him. The plea deal goes through. After the hearing, Nick steps outside to talk to reporters, and Darby follows, sarcastically thanking Nick for what he's done for him. Clyde watches it all unfold from a distance, and seeing the man who helped kill his family stroll away with such a light sentence changes how he sees the justice system forever. That night, Nick comes home to his wife, Kelly. He's emotionally wiped out from the case but tries to convince himself he made the right call. Kelly is pregnant at the time, and Nick talks tenderly to their unborn child, using the quiet moment to push away some of the unease still clinging to him. 10 years go by. Nick's career has continued to climb, but that ambition has come at a price. Work keeps eating into his family life, and he misses yet another one of his daughter's school performances. Kelly's patience is wearing thin, and she makes it clear he isn't spending enough time with their child. On that same day, Rupert is scheduled for execution. Rather than show up for his daughter's recital, Nick heads to the prison with his colleague Sarah to witness the lethal injection. As Rupert is strapped down, he insists one last time that he wasn't the one who killed Clyde's family, a claim that leaves both Nick and Sarah visibly rattled. Then the execution begins, and it goes horribly wrong. Instead of a peaceful death, the chemicals send Rupert into violent convulsions. He screams in agony as his body thrashes against the restraints while everyone in the viewing room looks on in horror. What was meant to be a routine procedure turns into a prolonged nightmare. Afterward, the warden swears nothing like this has ever happened before. By all accounts, the process shouldn't have caused that kind of suffering, and no one on staff can explain it. A police officer approaches Nick with a small bottle recovered from the execution setup, Written on it is a chilling phrase, the same one Darby said inside Clyde's home years earlier. The idea that fate can't be outrun. Nick immediately understands the implication, and attention swings toward Darby. As police start tracking him down, Darby ain't now a free man living his life. Faith has no idea what's closing in. While he's distracted, he gets a call from someone using a distorted, muffled voice. The caller starts rattling off private details about Darby's life, things no stranger should know, and Darby's confidence crumbles. The voice tells him to check outside, and when he does, he sees police cars converging from every direction. He panics, grabs a gun, and opens fire on the approaching officers. Almost instantly, the mystery caller phones again, telling Darby that if he wants to avoid arrest, he needs to ditch the gun and follow instructions carefully. He's directed toward an abandoned industrial area where, supposedly, an escape has already been arranged. Desperate and convinced this stranger is his lifeline, Darby follows the directions and eventually finds a police cruiser waiting with an officer inside who's been tasered and left unconscious. Darby wastes no time seizing the moment. He grabs the officer's gun and forces him to drive. They end up somewhere isolated, far from any police presence. Darby orders the officer out and forces him to his knees, convinced he's finally slipped free of the authorities. Then another call comes through. The distorted voice speaks again, and it dawns on Darby that whoever's been helping him escape was never trying to save him at all, and the officer standing in front of him is the same person. Darby's relief turns to terror the instant his supposed rescuer reveals his true identity. It's Clyde. Darby tries to shoot him, but the gun's been rigged. Instead of firing a bullet, it injects a chemical that paralyzes him instantly. He's fully conscious and aware of everything happening, but he can't move a muscle. Clyde hauls him off to a warehouse he's spent a long time preparing. When Darby wakes up, he's strapped down so thoroughly that escape isn't an option. Clyde calmly lays out what's coming, a pain unlike anything Darby has ever felt, deliberately drawn out so he stays alive to experience every second of it. Nothing about this is spontaneous. Every tool has been laid out ahead of time, every step planned to the letter. Clyde has spent a decade thinking through this exact moment, and now that Darby's helpless in front of him, he intends to make the punishment last as long as humanly possible. Before he starts, Clyde reminds Darby of that night 10 years earlier, when Clyde was the one who couldn't move, forced to watch as his family was destroyed. Now the roles have flipped completely. With cold, quiet satisfaction, Clyde throws Darby's own words back at him. Fate isn't something you can escape. Then he turns on the camera and begins methodically cutting Darby apart, turning what could have been a burst of rage into something calculated and deliberate. Meanwhile, Nick and Sarah are still trying to piece together what happened during Rupert's execution. The idea that the lethal injection was sabotaged becomes harder to ignore. Sarah wonders aloud if Darby could be behind it, but Nick brushes the theory off. In his view, Darby simply doesn't have the intelligence, patience, or technical know-how to pull off something that sophisticated. Soon after, police make a gruesome discovery: what's left of Darby's body, cut into roughly 25 pieces. The brutality of it immediately shifts the tone of the investigation, and even Nick is shaken by how precise the killing was. Sarah starts connecting the dots. There's one person with an obvious motive to hate both Rupert and Darby, Clyde. Digging into his recent activity, she uncovers a string of unusual financial moves. Clyde has liquidated much of what he owns and funneled the money into seemingly random properties. One of those happens to be the warehouse where Darby's remains turned up. That's enough for police to head straight to Clyde's house. He shows almost no sign of panic. As sirens close in, he calmly starts undressing, as though he's been expecting this moment. By the time officers arrive, he's waiting for them, offering no resistance. His eerie composure only makes the scene more unsettling. As he's led away in cuffs, Clyde locks eyes with Nick in a stare that says more than words could. Whatever's already happened, that look makes clear, is only the beginning. A search of Clyde's home turns up books on legal procedure and criminal law, suggesting he's spent years studying how the system actually works. Investigators also find a torn newspaper clipping showing Nick shaking hands with Darby after the plea deal years earlier. Clyde is taken to jail and placed in an interrogation room, still cuffed. The trouble for Nick and the investigators is simple. Suspicion isn't proof. They're convinced Clyde killed Darby, but they've got nothing that directly ties him to the crime. Their best shot is getting him to confess. Meanwhile, something far more disturbing is unfolding inside Nick's own house. His daughter receives a DVD that looks like footage from her school recital, and she begs Kelly to let her watch it right away. Kelly tells her to wait so they can all watch it together once Nick's home, but the girl can't resist and slips the disc into the player when her mom isn't looking. She quickly realizes it has nothing to do with her recital. It's footage of Clyde torturing Darby, and she's exposed to the horror before anyone can stop it. Back at the jail, Nick heads into the interrogation room to face Clyde directly. Before starting, he cuts the live monitoring feed so the conversation feels more private, then tries a new approach. Instead of accusing Clyde outright, he plays along, acting almost impressed, suggesting maybe Darby got exactly what he deserved. Clyde doesn't buy the act, but he starts talking anyway. He admits that over the years, he imagined killing both Darby and Rupert countless times. Different methods, different opportunities, different scenarios. Nick treats this as a confession and gets up to leave, satisfied, but Clyde stops him cold. In a calm, measured voice, Clyde describes Nick's daily routine with unsettling accuracy. Where he goes, how his days are structured, and tells him, politely, to sit back down. Nick refuses and insists the interview's over. Clyde disagrees. Nothing he's said actually qualifies as a legal confession. Thinking about murder isn't the same as admitting to committing one. He's never directly said he killed Darby, and he knows full well the authorities have no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Even the warehouse proves little, since he owns dozens of properties across the country. If it comes to it, he can simply claim someone planted Darby's remains there to frame him. Frustrated, Nick tells him everyone already knows he's guilty. Clyde flips Nick's own logic back on him. Knowing something means nothing in court unless you can prove it. Nick realizes exactly what's happening. The same reasoning that once let Darby walk with a light sentence is now shielding the man out for revenge against him. Clyde offers a deal, a full confession, but only if Nick gives him something first. His opening demand is almost laughably small: a proper bed for his cell. Nick reads it as manipulation and, letting pride get the better of him, walks out instead of taking the deal. Jonas, Nick's boss, is furious when he hears about it. From his perspective, trading a mattress for a confession is an easy call. They have almost no solid evidence against Clyde, so refusing over something so minor makes no sense. Nick argues Clyde's just playing games, but Jonas doesn't care and tells him flatly to stop treating this like a personal grudge match and just make the deal. Eventually, Clyde gets his matter say and the other inmates notice. One of them takes an immediate interest in Clyde's upgraded setup, hinting that special treatment behind bars might create its own set of problems. Soon after, Clyde appears in court for a bail hearing. The warden, already irritated with him, makes his frustration obvious. Nick argues hard that Clyde should stay locked up and asks the judge to deny bail, but Clyde speaks for himself, presenting himself as an ordinary, law-abiding citizen. He points out that Nick has no actual evidence linking him to Darby's murder and argues the government can't just keep someone locked up indefinitely on suspicion alone. Nick counters by reminding the court that Clyde promised a full confession and never delivered. For a moment, the judge seems swayed and looks ready to release him until Clyde suddenly starts clapping. The whole courtroom turns toward him as he sarcastically congratulates her for being ready to free a suspected murderer over a well-delivered speech. He mocks the court's logic, calls it dangerously naive, and keeps pushing even after being warned to stop insulting the judge and questioning her judgment. Finally, she's had enough. Furious, she has him removed from the courtroom and denies bail. Back in interrogation, Clyde tells Nick that the footage sent to his family was meant as an example of good triumphing over evil, and he finally admits for the first time directly that he's the man in the video with Darby. It's the closest thing to a confession Nick has gotten, but Clyde says there's more where that came from, and again, he wants something in exchange. This time, it's an extravagant meal, a 20-ounce steak, medium rare, and an iPod delivered along with lunch. Nick can hardly believe it and turns to leave until Clyde gives him a reason to stay. He says the next confession could save the life of Bill Reynolds, Darby's old defense attorney. Nick immediately grasps the stakes, and when he checks in with Sarah, she confirms things just got a lot more serious. Bill Reynolds has been missing for 3 days. Clyde looks straight into the surveillance camera and lays out his terms. If Nick wants Bill alive, every demand needs to be met exactly, and everything has to be done by 1 p.m. the next day. When the deadline nears, prison staff bring Clyde his meal, prepared exactly as ordered but with just minutes to spare. The warden insists on one last inspection, and that delay costs them. By the time the food reaches Clyde's cell, it's already 8 minutes past 1 o'clock. Clyde stays perfectly calm. He gives Nick Bill's location, then adds a devastating detail. The 1 o'clock deadline was never about his lunch. It was Bill's deadline. Nick immediately understands and rushes to a waiting helicopter, racing toward the location with his team, desperate not to be too late. Back in his cell, Clyde settles in to enjoy his steak with music playing, joined by his cellmate, and for a moment the two almost seem friendly. Clyde shares food, keeps the mood light, but it's all a setup. What he really wants is the large T-shaped bone in the steak. He cranks up the music, hands his cellmate the controls, and gets him distracted. Then, without warning, Clyde uses the sharpened bone as a weapon, stabbing the man repeatedly until he's dead. He calmly lies back down afterward, as if nothing happened. When the warden checks the cell, he finds absolute carnage. Meanwhile, Nick and his team reach the site Clyde described and find Bill buried underground, connected to a limited oxygen supply, but he's already dead. The timing is brutal. It took the team about 15 minutes to get there from the prison. If Clyde's lunch had arrived on time, Nick would have had Bill's location soon enough to save him. Those 8 lost minutes made all the difference. Not long after, Sarah delivers more grim news. Clyde has killed his cellmate, and as a result, the warden is transferring him to solitary. Nick goes to confront him there, demanding to know why Clyde keeps escalating and why more people have to die over something that happened a decade ago. Clyde's answer is straightforward. He wants people to face consequences for their choices. Nick pulls out something deeply personal, the bracelet Clyde's daughter once made for him, and asks whether Clyde really believes his wife and daughter would approve of what he's become. It clearly touches a nerve, but Clyde doesn't waver. In his mind, this isn't senseless violence. It's the justice the legal system failed to give him. Later, Nick and Jonas meet with a government official who knows far more about Clyde's history than either of them expected. The picture he paints is unsettling. Clyde isn't just a grieving engineer, he's an exceptionally skilled strategist, trained to think many moves ahead and orchestrate deaths without ever being physically present. According to the official, Clyde specializes in killing from a distance, which changes everything. Even his imprisonment might be part of a larger design. The official believes Clyde let himself get caught because being behind bars serves some purpose in his bigger plan, and warns them not to write off the cellmate's murder as random. That man was likely just another piece on the board. He urges Nick and Jonas to stop treating each incident as isolated and start looking for what Clyde intends next, since every victim, every demand, every seemingly pointless move could be setting up his next play. Most alarming of all, if Clyde has decided someone should die, a jail cell won't necessarily stop him. The only sure way to end the threat, the official says, is to go into his cell and kill him before he finishes what he started. He also confirms what Nick already suspects: Clyde is targeting everyone connected to the case involving his wife and daughter. Armed with this, Nick and Jonas rush to Judge Laura and ask for extreme restrictions on Clyde, cutting him off from all outside contact. No visitors, no calls, nothing. It pushes right up against the edge of his rights, but they argue normal procedure isn't enough anymore. Too many people are already dead. Laura reluctantly signs the order. Almost immediately after, her phone rings. She answers and it explodes in her hand, killing her instantly while Nick and Jonas watch, frozen in shock. The message is unmistakable. Clyde is still calling the shots from inside prison. Nick confronts him again, demanding to know who's helping him from the outside. Someone has to be placing bombs and carrying out his orders. He also presses Clyde on his obsession with revenge, and this time Clyde finally cracks. He's furious that Nick still doesn't get the point. This was never just about revenge. If all he'd wanted was to hurt Nick personally, he could have killed his wife and daughter 10 years ago. He had every opportunity. His goal is bigger. He wants Nick, and the whole system, to understand what happens when convenience, conviction rates, and plea deals get put ahead of real justice. Then he issues an ultimatum: release him, fully and without charges, before 6 o'clock the next morning, or everyone involved will pay. Security tightens immediately. Clyde is moved to an even more secure part of the prison under heavy guard. That night, Nick and Sarah stay late combing through records, financial documents, and case files, desperate to identify Clyde's outside help. They come up empty, and the deeper they dig, the more impossible it all seems. During the long night, Sarah brings up something they've both avoided for years: whether the plea deal with Darby was ever the right call, and whether Clyde's been right about that all along. Nick refuses to accept it, insisting they made the only reasonable choice available at the time without the deal. Both suspects could have walked. The team stays at the prison past the 6 o'clock deadline. Clyde isn't released, and for a few minutes, nothing happens. Believing the danger has passed, Nick sends everyone home to rest. As staff head to the parking lot, Sarah gets into her car and hidden explosives start going off, one triggering another, turning the lot into an inferno as vehicles explode in sequence. Sarah looks toward Nick through the chaos, and before either can react, her car explodes, killing her instantly. Nick is devastated, and the attack confirms what he already suspected: Clyde can't be working alone, since he was locked in a maximum security cell when it happened. Yet the operation went off exactly as planned. 6 officers die in the bombing. Nick and Jonas are summoned to meet the mayor, who's stunned that one imprisoned man has managed to terrorize the entire city from behind bars. With the threat clearly extending beyond the original case, she assigns personal security to both men. Nick immediately focuses on protecting his family, sending Kelly and their daughter to a secret location under the guise of a surprise trip, so his daughter won't fully grasp what's happening. The precautions are extreme: and no credit cards, no regular phone calls, nothing that could leave a trail. Nick wants them untraceable until Clyde is stopped. After seeing them off, Nick returns home and notices something that chills him: a framed newspaper article deliberately placed where he'll find it. Someone has clearly been inside his house. Clyde's reach is closer than he thought. Later, at the prison, Clyde is allowed out for a supervised walk and unexpectedly crosses paths with Nick and the detective. Nick loses control and attacks him, and even as the guards struggle to pull him off, Clyde stays eerily calm, warning Nick that everything so far is only the beginning. The detective, just as furious, draws his weapon, ready to shoot, but Nick stops him. As Clyde is led away, he leaves them with one more warning: what's coming next will be remembered on a historic scale. Not long after, Sarah's funeral is held, and the mood is heavy as everyone processes just how many lives have already been lost. During the service, Jonas admits something Nick has refused to say out loud: that their own choices helped set this disaster in motion. The plea deal, the compromises, the belief that a conviction mattered more than giving Clyde the justice he expected. Nick still insists they made the right legal call a decade ago, but for the first time, his certainty wavers. When the funeral ends, Nick and Jonas leave in heavily guarded vehicles, unaware that another attack is already underway. Somewhere nearby, a figure dressed in black takes control of a military-grade drone armed with a machine gun, an EMP device, and a rocket launcher, and aims it at the convoy. The drone fires its electronic weapon first, cutting power to the vehicles and stranding them. Then it opens fire directly on Jonas's car, tearing through the armor and trapping everyone inside. Not satisfied, the attacker locks on for a final strike and launches a rocket that obliterates the vehicle, killing Jonas and everyone with him. Once again, Clyde appears to have struck without ever being present. The mayor is livid. The death toll keeps climbing, public fear is spreading, and the city looks helpless against a man supposedly locked away. She confronts Nick over how badly things have spiraled, and for a moment it seems she might remove him, but political pressure changes her mind. With the media demanding accountability, she needs a public face for the crisis, so instead of firing Nick, she promotes him to district attorney and declares emergency restrictions across the city to try to prevent another attack. Nick now has more authority, but little satisfaction. Sarah's dead, Jonas is dead, and Clyde is still somehow pulling strings. Then a new lead surfaces, an email tied to research Sarah had been doing before she died, involving real estate deals connected to Clyde. Nick digs into properties sold across Philadelphia over the past decade, comparing prices, values, and ownership records instead of just looking for obvious connections. One property stands out: a small garage close to the prison, owned by Clyde. Nick and the detective head there immediately. At first, it looks unremarkable. Then they find a hidden opening beneath the floor leading underground, and climbing down, they discover an elaborate tunnel system running directly beneath the prison, with access points and 2 individual cells. Clyde was never truly trapped. He'd been slipping in and out of his cell undetected the whole time. It suddenly makes sense how the impossible murders happened. There was no outside accomplice pulling strings. Clyde had been doing much of it himself. The tunnels also reveal that his cellmate's murder wasn't spontaneous at all. Clyde had deliberately positioned himself for it, planning every detail well in advance. The detective checks Clyde's cell. It's empty. While Nick and the detective explore the tunnel network, Clyde is already moving on his next phase. Disguised as a maintenance worker, he slips past light security and enters City Hall unnoticed. Back underground, Nick and the detective find surveillance equipment. Clyde has hidden cameras in multiple places, including inside Nick's home, explaining how he always seemed to know so much. Among the gear, they spot a quote attributed to military strategist Karl von Clausewitz about targeting an enemy's center of gravity at the point where power is concentrated. Nick immediately understands. For Clyde, that's City Hall, where the mayor is about to hold a major security meeting. Clyde isn't after one more official. He's aiming to wipe out the city's entire leadership in a single strike. Authorities race to City Hall, but Nick and the detective know they can't storm in without risking a leak. If Clyde's watching, an obvious evacuation could tip him off. They search quietly and find a suspicious suitcase on the 5th floor, directly below the meeting room. A bomb technician confirms their fears. It's powerful enough to level the conference room above, and worse, it's rigged to a remote trigger. A single phone call could set it off at any second. Meanwhile, officers watching Clyde's property spot movement. He's back. They alert Nick as Clyde enters the tunnel facility and watches through his surveillance feed as the mayor's meeting begins exactly where he planned. He takes out his phone, then starts climbing back through the tunnel toward his cell, only to find Nick already waiting for him when he emerges. Clyde is genuinely thrown off guard. Nick levels his gun and orders him to stop, urging him to finally do the right thing and surrender before anyone else dies. Clyde, almost amused, asks if Nick's come to make one more deal, and the question lands hard, forcing Nick to confront the pattern Clyde's been exposing all along. Year after year, he'd solved problems by negotiating. The deal with Darby because it felt safer than a trial. Favors traded with Clyde for information. Always a deal, because deals got results. This time, Nick refuses. There will be no negotiating with a murderer. He gives Clyde one last chance to call off the attack himself, warning him that if he detonates that bomb, there's no taking it back. He'll carry it for the rest of his life. For a second, Clyde seems to weigh it. Then he quietly apologizes, presses the button, and makes the call. The bomb is armed. Nick turns to leave, pausing only to point out one flaw in Clyde's plan. He won't have much of a life left to regret anything. He's got about 25 seconds. Clyde's expression changes as, at that same moment, the detective seals the tunnel behind him, cutting off his escape route. Only then does Clyde realize the truth. The bomb isn't in City Hall anymore. While he was making his way back to his cell, Nick and the detective moved the suitcase and planted it under Clyde's own bed. Now he's trapped in the very cell that once served as the heart of his operation. With seconds left, Clyde stops fighting and reaches for the bracelet his daughter made him all those years ago, letting it carry him back to the life he lost: his wife, his daughter, the family taken from him. He looks at it one last time, then the bomb goes off, and the explosion consumes his cell, bringing his decade-long campaign to its end. And so the story comes full circle. Clyde began as a grieving husband and father who believed the justice system had failed him. Over 10 years, that grief hardened into a calculated mission to punish everyone he blamed for that failure. By the end, one question still lingers: was Clyde exposing a broken system and claiming the justice he was denied, or did his pursuit of accountability turn him into exactly the kind of monster he set out to punish? That's the story. So after everything that happened, do you think Clyde deserves any sympathy for what he did, or was the justice the courts handed down the only kind he ever had the right to seek? Law-abiding citizen doesn't waste any time before putting Clyde Shelton through the nightmare that shapes everything he becomes. He's at home with his wife and daughter, living an ordinary life, when two men break in. The attack is brutal, sudden, and deliberately uncomfortable to watch. Clyde survives, but his family doesn't. That's the emotional engine driving the whole film. The problem is the movie moves through this setup so fast that we barely get to know Clyde's wife and daughter before they're gone. Probably one of the script's weak points. You understand his pain because the situation itself is horrifying, but you don't feel like you actually knew these people. A bit more time with the family might have made his grief land even harder. Still, the scene accomplishes what it needs to. It gives Clyde a reason to believe the justice system is the last thing that can make any of this mean something. Then Nick Rice steps in, a successful prosecutor clearly proud of his record. The catch is that keeping that record intact sometimes means making deals, and from his perspective, securing some kind of conviction beats risking a trial and losing everything. That logic might work on paper, but try telling it to Clyde. One of the men who destroyed his family gets a deal in exchange for helping convict the other. Legally, Nick can defend it. Professionally, he can defend it even more easily. But Clyde isn't thinking about statistics. He watched his wife and child die. So when he's essentially told that justice has to be negotiated because that's how the system works, something in him breaks. This is where the film gets genuinely interesting, at least for a while. Because Clyde isn't just angry at the killers anymore, he's angry at the process itself. He's furious that something this horrific can be reduced to evidence, conviction percentages, and whatever deal the prosecution feels safe securing. You can disagree with where he eventually takes this, and the movie absolutely pushes him past any reasonable line, but it's hard not to understand why he feels betrayed. The system doesn't fail him by letting the killers go free. They're caught. It fails him because the outcome doesn't feel like justice from where he's standing. And that's a very different thing. Nick sees compromise as essential to making the law function. Clyde sees it as compromising with a murderer. That gap is where everything else in the story grows from. Then the movie jumps ahead 10 years. Clyde has had a decade to sit with all of it and not to heal, not to forgive, just to plan. When he re-enters the story, he's no longer the helpless man from the opening. The early stages of his revenge are where the film is strongest, because Clyde still feels human, calculated and cold, sure, but there's a clear emotional thread connecting what he's doing now to what was done to him. That's what puts the audience in an uncomfortable spot. You're watching a man commit horrifying acts, but there's still a small voice saying, I get why he's doing this, not approval, just understanding. That distinction is what gives the film real weight. Clyde doesn't declare war on the whole world right away, either. His revenge starts with the people directly tied to his family's murder. A simple, traceable motivation. They hurt his family, the system failed to punish them properly, so now he'll do it himself. Ugly, but emotionally coherent. Then the mission starts to expand, and that's where Clyde's transformation gets complicated. First it's the killers, then it's Nick, for making the deal, then everyone connected to the prosecution, because they're part of the same system. Before long, Clyde isn't avenging his family anymore. He's trying to prove a point, trying to teach the entire justice system a lesson. That's a massive shift. He's no longer just saying you failed me, he's saying the whole structure is broken and he intends to expose it. The trouble is the film also starts changing Clyde in ways that stretch credibility. The opening works because he feels like an ordinary man who suffered something extraordinary. Later, we learn what he's actually capable of, and suddenly this supposedly average family man has planning skills, technical expertise, and resources that make everyone around him look completely outmatched. He goes from being well prepared to nearly impossible to surprise, and that's where the character starts to lose something. Clyde is scarier when he's human. A grieving father who spent a decade plotting revenge is disturbing precisely because you can picture that kind of obsession. A man who seems to predict every reaction and manipulate events from anywhere, with an answer for every problem, is a different kind of story altogether, and the more powerful he becomes, the less the original tragedy seems to matter. That's the strange arc of Clyde Shelton. The film starts by making him painfully relatable, then gradually turns him into something almost mythic. You understand the father, the victim, even the rage, but once he becomes a criminal mastermind who seems to control nearly everything, that emotional connection weakens. He stops being a man broken by the system and starts becoming the movie's supervillain. That transformation isn't handled smoothly. There are moments where the film clearly wants us to remember the husband and father from the opening, the man who trusted the system and got crushed by it, and then 5 minutes later, he's executing something so elaborate you stop thinking about his grief and start wondering how any human being could possibly pull it off. That undercuts the premise, because the truly unsettling version of this story isn't about an unstoppable genius. It's about what happens when an ordinary person completely loses faith in the system. That's far darker. Clyde's arc works best as tragedy, victim, then vigilante, then a man convinced his pain gives him the right to decide who deserves punishment. And somewhere in there, he stops fighting injustice and starts creating more of it. That should be the point where the audience turns against him completely, but because his original grievance is so understandable, it never becomes that simple, and that tension is exactly what keeps the first half of the film compelling. The law failed Clyde, and that doesn't excuse everything he does afterward, but both things being true at once is exactly why the setup works as well as it does. What makes Law-Abiding Citizen more interesting than a typical revenge movie is how it keeps unsettling your sense of who you're supposed to be rooting for. Usually these stories are simple. One man is wronged, he goes after those responsible, and the film tells you exactly when to cheer. Here, it's messier. Clyde is clearly doing terrible things. There's no getting around that. He crosses lines early and keeps crossing them until revenge becomes something much bigger and uglier. But by that point, the movie has already done something risky. It made you understand him first. You've seen what happened to his family, watched the legal system strike a deal that feels completely unacceptable from his point of view. So even once Clyde starts doing things you can't defend, part of the audience still remembers why he became this person, and that complicates everything. Nick is supposed to represent the other side of the argument, and importantly, he's not some cartoonishly corrupt prosecutor. He's ambitious, and comfortable with compromise if it secures convictions, but he genuinely sees those choices as part of how the system is supposed to work. That's the core divide. Nick believes justice has to operate within rules. Clyde believes rules mean nothing if they protect the wrong people. Neither position is unreasonable when the film first sets them against each other, and that's where the movie is at its sharpest. Because Clyde isn't just trying to hurt Nick, he's trying to prove him wrong. That's a far better conflict than a simple chase. Whenever these two share a scene, in court, in prison, across a negotiation, the film gets sharper, and the action almost feels secondary to the real fight happening in conversation. Clyde keeps forcing Nick to reckon with his choices. Why did you make that deal? Why did your conviction record matter more than doing right? Why should anyone trust a system that can look at something horrific and still reduce it to a negotiation? Nick's implicit answer is that the alternative is chaos. The law can't bend to individual emotion, and you can't just decide someone deserves punishment and carry it out yourself. He's right about that. But Clyde's counter is just as uncomfortable. What happens when people following the rules still produce an unjust outcome? The film keeps circling that question, not always subtly, but it's there, and it's probably why so many viewers end up rooting for Clyde longer than the filmmakers likely intended. He's committing murder, terrorizing people, eventually targeting individuals who had nothing to do with what happened to his family. At some point, logically, sympathy should run out, except it doesn't always, because Nick and the system never fully erase Clyde's original grievance. The plea deal happened, the compromise happened. Nobody can retroactively make that feel morally acceptable just because Clyde later turns monstrous. So the film ends up in this strange place where the villain is clearly doing worse things than the people he's targeting, yet he can still sound more convincing than they do, which is genuinely fascinating. There are moments where Clyde feels less like a man evading justice and more like someone staging a demonstration. Take the courtroom scene. He understands exactly how the system works and uses its own logic to argue his way toward freedom, and when it succeeds, instead of celebrating, he turns around and exposes how absurd that outcome actually is. That's Clyde in a nutshell. He doesn't just want to break the system, he wants it to humiliate itself. And Nick is the student he's chosen to teach. Their dynamic almost becomes a twisted mentor and pupil relationship. Clyde insisting Nick made the wrong call 10 years ago and forcing him to understand why, while Nick slowly realizes this stopped being a murder investigation a long time ago. It's personal now, aimed at his beliefs, his career, his confidence, and eventually his safety. That's where the psychological chess match really shines. Clyde plans, Nick reacts. Nick thinks he's finally caught up, and Clyde reveals he was already 3 steps ahead. Sometimes it tips into the ridiculous, sure, but before the film pushes too far, there's real satisfaction in watching Nick grasp just how badly he underestimated the man across from him. What also makes this work is that both men are flawed in ways the film doesn't always fully resolve. Nick isn't evil, he's just too comfortable with compromise. Clyde isn't purely evil either, at least not initially. He's someone convinced his suffering has granted him moral authority, and that's dangerous, because once he decides he alone knows what justice looks like, there's no natural limit. First it's the killers, then Nick, then everyone connected to the case, then the institution itself. And once you're targeting an entire system, almost anyone can become a target. That's the point where vigilante justice stops resembling justice at all. But the film also understands why that fantasy is appealing. Most of us, faced with something horrific, would still turn to the legal system. That's reality. Cinema, though, gives you this strange space to imagine the opposite. No appeals, no negotiations, no technicalities, just direct consequences. There's a cathartic pull to that, even if it's morally ugly, and the film knows exactly how to lean into it. You're not meant to literally endorse what Clyde does, but there's a real difference between approving of revenge and understanding the emotional pull of wanting it, which is why some of the deaths almost play like guilty wish fulfillment. The arrogant authorities suddenly look helpless. The people who trusted procedures suddenly have no control. The system that told Clyde to accept compromise now has to face someone who refuses to compromise at all. There's something darkly satisfying in that setup, right up until the cost gets too high, and that's where the movie should have widened the lens beyond just Clyde and Nick. If a real person started doing what Clyde does, the public reaction would be enormous. People arguing everywhere, some calling him a terrorist, some a vigilante, some condemning him outright, others admitting they don't support his methods but understand his anger. That larger debate could have made the film so much richer, but instead we're mostly just told people are panicking. We never really see that argument play out beyond the government and legal system. That's a missed opportunity, because Clyde isn't attacking some obscure institution. He's attacking something every citizen has to trust, at least to some degree. Imagine if the film had shown ordinary people losing faith, defending the system, or debating whether Clyde had actually exposed something real. That would have pushed the story past a personal revenge battle into a much bigger moral reckoning. Instead, almost everyone outside Clyde and Nick becomes part of the machinery. A target, an investigator, an official, someone waiting for the next move. And that's a shame, because this premise should be dividing people, and it already does divide the audience. One viewer sees a psychopath, another sees a broken man who went too far, Someone sees Nick as the responsible adult trying to restore order. Someone else sees him as the reason Clyde exists in the first place. There's no comfortable seat to sit in. That's why the Clyde-Nick relationship stays interesting even as the plot gets sillier. They're not really fighting over who wins. They're fighting over whose definition of justice survives. Nick believes a flawed system still beats one person deciding everything alone. Clyde believes a system that knowingly compromises justice has forfeited its moral authority. Push either belief too far and you get something ugly. A system obsessed with procedure turns cold and indifferent, while a man obsessed with personal justice turns into a tyrant. That's the gray area the film keeps circling, and strangely, it never fully resolves it. Maybe that's a weakness, but it's also why the film sticks with people. Because even after Clyde becomes impossible to defend, the question that created him is still sitting there. What do you do when the law gives you an answer that doesn't feel like justice at all? If there's one thing this movie absolutely nails, it's that everything lives or dies on Clyde Shelton, and Gerard Butler clearly knows it. This role could have easily gone off the rails. Clyde needs to be grieving, terrifying, intelligent, unpredictable, wounded, and still believable enough that you get why people are drawn to him. And Butler pulls off most of that. His calmness is what works best. He's not shouting his way through the film or performing menace. A lot of his danger comes from how relaxed he seems. He can sit motionless in a prison cell and still feel like the most powerful person in the room, which lands far better than playing Clyde as a straightforward revenge machine. There's always a sense that he knows something no one else does, and usually he does. Added confidence makes him endlessly watchable. You're constantly anticipating the next line, the next move, the next reveal, and even when the plot tips into absurdity, Butler keeps Clyde compelling because there's real personality underneath the planning. He also sells the emotional side better than you might expect. The film doesn't spend much time developing Clyde before the tragedy hits, but Butler still conveys enough grief and bitterness that his later transformation doesn't feel like a total disconnect. And you can tell this is a man who's been trapped inside the same moment for years. And that matters. Not everyone's going to love the performance, though, and it's fair criticism that Butler occasionally pushes Clyde too far into theatrical mastermind territory. Some scenes feel less like a damaged father and more like a very controlled supervillain routine. The voice, the confidence, the little smiles, the unshakable calm. And once the script hands Clyde nearly impossible abilities, that style becomes even harder to ignore. Still, Butler is the reason the character holds together as long as it does. He has a presence that's genuinely difficult to fake. Jamie Foxx has a tougher assignment as Nick Rice, not because he's incapable, but because the screenplay hands Clyde nearly all the compelling material. Clyde gets the speeches, the mystery, the threats, the shocking reveals. Nick mostly walks into rooms and discovers what Clyde's already done, and that imbalance shapes how the performances land. Foxx plays Nick as confident, professional, ambitious, occasionally arrogant, which fits the character. But early on Nick isn't especially likable. He's proud of his win record, believes firmly in how he does his job, and doesn't seem particularly moved by how Clyde experiences the plea deal emotionally. That can make him feel colder than the film probably intends, which is odd, since he's technically on the lawful side of the story. You'd expect him to be easier to root for, but he isn't, at least not at first. Foxx also plays him pretty straight, which becomes a problem opposite Butler's unpredictability. There are stretches where Nick feels less like Clyde's equal and more like the guy reacting to Clyde's performance. That said, Foxx gets noticeably better once the story turns into a full cat-and-mouse game. The more personal the conflict becomes, the more compelling Nick gets. That polished prosecutor confidence starts slipping away as people around him die and his own choices get thrown back in his face. His family becomes vulnerable, and you can see the character slowly realizing this case is dragging things to the surface he never wanted to look at. Those later scenes between Foxx and Butler are stronger, with more tension, frustration, and desperation, and the dynamic starts to feel like two men genuinely trying to break each other psychologically. That's where Foxx's performance really lands. The issue is that Nick's arc can feel messy. He'll make a choice that seems emotionally earned, and then the plot yanks him somewhere else entirely. His career ambition is a good example. He's supposed to be learning something from Clyde, confronting the cost of treating justice like a numbers game. But the film never fully convinces you he's changed as deeply as it wants us to believe. Sometimes his choices track with the character, other times they track with wherever the screenplay needs him to be, and that undercuts Foxx, since an actor can only do so much when a character's internal logic keeps shifting under him. There's also a missed opportunity in Nick's family. Once Clyde's campaign puts them in danger, that should add a whole new emotional layer. Now Nick knows what it's like to have someone put the people he loves at risk. That should hit hard. But the film hasn't spent enough time with his family beforehand for those scenes to land with real weight. We register the fear and the stakes, but emotionally it stays fairly thin. Interestingly, the film has the same problem with Clyde's family. Both men are shaped by what happens to the people they love, but those relationships mostly exist to motivate the men rather than stand on their own. The supporting cast fares better. Cole Meany brings the kind of grounded, weary, been there done that energy the film needs. He feels like someone who's spent years buried in ugly cases and has no patience left for theatrics, which helps anchor the story as Clyde's plans grow more elaborate. Bruce McGill has that same dependable quality. He doesn't need flashy moments to feel credible, and in a film that gets less believable as it goes, that's valuable. Viola Davis has a relatively small role, and reactions to her seem mixed, but I'd argue what matters is the authority she brings. At the moment she enters a scene, you believe people listen to her. Not every line she's given works, but she adds real weight to the government side of the story. Leslie Bibb has even less to work with. Her character exists within Nick's professional orbit but, like much of the supporting cast, never develops into a distinct perspective on what Clyde is doing. That's probably the bigger issue with the supporting characters overall, and not that the performances are weak, because most aren't, but that the film doesn't really use them. Nearly everyone becomes a piece on Clyde and Nick's chessboard. Someone investigates, someone delivers information, someone becomes a target, someone gives an order, someone reacts to Clyde's latest move, and then the story moves on. Very few get their own opinion on the larger moral question. Imagine if the people around Nick actually pushed back on him. A prosecutor who thought Clyde had a point, a detective who hated Clyde's methods while admitting the original deal was wrong, someone in government who believed the system had to be defended no matter the cost. That would have made the supporting cast part of the film's moral debate rather than just useful, well-acted pieces of machinery, and that absence puts even more pressure on Butler and Foxx to carry the film. Foxx has his moments once things get personal, but there's no question who owns this movie. Whenever Clyde's on screen, the energy shifts. You may hate what he's doing, you may stop buying how he's doing it, but you're still watching him. And in a story built around a character who controls everyone around him, Butler essentially does the same thing to the audience. One thing the film consistently gets right is momentum. Even when it starts asking you to accept some pretty wild logic, Director F. Gary Gray keeps things moving with enough confidence that, for a while, you just go along with it, and that matters, because this is a movie that could have easily buckled under its own weight. Courtroom drama, prison manipulation, revenge killings, investigations, moral debate, elaborate traps, explosions. There's a lot happening, and Gray's approach is essentially to never let the pressure ease up. Even the quieter scenes carry an uneasy undercurrent, as if Clyde is still controlling the room even when he's nowhere near it. That's one of the stronger elements of the direction. There's always a sense that something's about to happen, and when it finally does, it tends to hit hard. The botched lethal injection is probably the clearest example. It's not violent just for shock value, but because of how the scene is built. Everything about an execution should feel controlled and clinical, and then Clyde's plan starts unraveling the control, turning something rigidly procedural into something horrifyingly unpredictable. The film pulls that trick more than once, taking spaces that are supposed to feel orderly, courtrooms, prisons, government buildings, and letting Clyde turn them into places where nobody knows what's coming next. That's where the thriller elements are strongest. You're not just waiting to see who gets targeted, you're trying to figure out how Clyde pulled it off. and for a good stretch, that mystery is genuinely fun. There are moments where the film almost dares you to solve it before the characters do, as sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, and even once the logic falls apart under scrutiny later, the scene itself still lands in the moment. That's the film's core dynamic. Individual moments often work better than the larger plot connecting them. You'll watch a sequence and think it was expertly staged, and then 10 minutes later start wondering how Clyde possibly arranged it, and the whole thing starts unraveling in your head. But in the moment, it works. And that's Gray's real strength here. The prison scenes play out similarly well. Clyde is technically locked up, supposedly powerless, and yet the film keeps finding ways to make his imprisonment feel like an extension of his plan rather than the end of it. There's something inherently satisfying about watching the authorities believe they've finally contained him, only to realize being behind bars might not be the disadvantage they assumed. Ridiculous eventually, sure, but entertaining. The courtroom material works for similar reasons. Gray knows when not to overcomplicate a scene. Butler can simply sit there and talk. No chases or big reveals needed every 30 seconds. Clyde's confidence alone carries it. That balance, knowing when to deliver disturbing violence and when to slow down for a confrontation, is probably the film's greatest strength in its first half. The problem is that as the story progresses, it starts leaning more on the big set pieces than the quieter moments. You can feel it deciding every new sequence has to top the last, more elaborate, more shocking, more impossible, and the nature of the suspense shifts as a result. Early on, you're wondering what Clyde will do next. Later, you're wondering what completely absurd thing he's somehow already arranged. Still entertaining, but a different flavor of it. The film starts as a tense, nasty story and gradually morphs into a high-concept game where Clyde seems capable of engineering nearly anything, and Gray keeps directing it with a completely straight face. That's where the tonal cracks start showing. If the film had leaned into its own absurdity a bit more, some of those later beats might have gone down easier. But Gray never winks at the audience, never acknowledges Clyde has essentially become a comic book criminal mastermind. So when something wholly unbelievable happens, the film still presents it as grounded crime drama. Sometimes that confidence carries you through anyway, sometimes it really doesn't. Visually, the film suits its subject matter well. There's a muted, cold quality throughout, nothing colorful or comfortable, and even the clean institutional spaces have a slightly lifeless quality that mirrors Clyde's state of mind. This isn't a triumphant feeling revenge story, it's bitter and claustrophobic, and sharp visual contrasts in certain scenes help keep that sense of danger alive. The execution sequence intercut with the daughter's cello performance is a strange, maybe overly obvious choice, but rhythmically and visually it sticks with you. A controlled musical performance running alongside something going horribly wrong creates a genuinely uneasy tension. Whether it fully fits the film's tone is debatable, but it's memorable, and that's true of quite a few moments here. You might question the taste or logic behind them, but you remember them. The score pulls real weight, too, especially in quieter scenes. There are stretches where not much is happening physically, but the music keeps a low hum of pressure underneath the dialogue. So even a simple conversation between Clyde and Nick feels like it could snap open at any moment. That's valuable, because the film's best moments aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes it's Clyde sitting perfectly calm while everyone else grows nervous, or Nick realizing another piece of the plan has already played out, or just the silence right before something bad arrives. The score understands that instinctively. And then there's the violence, which is genuinely mean-spirited. The opening home invasion makes that clear from the start. Brutal, ugly, deliberately uncomfortable. The revenge sequences that follow are even more calculated. Clyde doesn't just kill people, he wants them to suffer and understand exactly why. That gives the violence a nasty edge, and because the film wants us to stay emotionally tethered to Clyde for at least part of the runtime, it creates a genuinely uncomfortable reaction, and you understand the fury behind what he's doing while simultaneously thinking the punishment has gone way too far. That tension is effective, at least at first. The problem is that each act of revenge has to top the last, and eventually shock starts replacing meaning. The early attacks matter because they're directly tied to Clyde's grievance. Later ones start to feel like the film prioritizing audience surprise over what the violence actually says about the character. And that's where the brutality shifts from disturbing to mechanical. You stop processing it emotionally and just wait for the next beat. Still, as a straightforward action thriller, plenty of it works. There's enough reversal, enough "how did he pull that off?" to keep you hooked. And that's likely why the film has such a devoted following despite the criticism. It's easy to pick apart afterward, very easy, but while you're watching it, there are long stretches where it simply moves. You're curious, tense, invested in what Clyde's planning, how Nick will respond, whether the authorities can finally get ahead of him. And the film keeps feeding that curiosity. That's real entertainment value. It's not subtle, and it's definitely not restrained, and once the plot starts escalating, it becomes harder to believe. But it's rarely boring. That's probably the fairest thing you can say about Gray's direction. He doesn't always make the story believable, but he consistently makes it watchable, and with a thriller like this, that alone can carry you further than the logic deserves. What's frustrating about Law-Abiding Citizen is that there's clearly a stronger movie buried inside the one we got. For a stretch, you can see exactly what that film is. A grieving father loses faith in the justice system, spends years preparing his response, and forces the prosecutor who failed him to confront the consequences. That's a solid foundation, and it gives the film something to argue about beyond simple revenge. The early scenes stay focused. Clyde's motivation makes sense, Nick's position makes sense even if you disagree with it, and their conflict has a clear moral shape. You understand why both men believe they're right. Then the film starts piling on machinery more, and then even more. At first, Clyde's preparation is impressive. He's had 10 years, so it's believable he studied everyone involved and built contingencies. But the script keeps pushing past that point until Clyde isn't just prepared, he seems prepared for literally everything. He knows how people will react, where they'll be, what they'll decide, and he can apparently manipulate events from inside a prison cell with absurd precision. Every time the authorities close one door, the script reveals Clyde built another one a decade ago, and at some point that stops feeling clever and starts feeling convenient, which is a meaningful difference. A smart character is fun because you can trace how he got ahead. An all-knowing character removes the tension entirely, since the only real question becomes how ridiculous his next trick will be, and the film does get pretty ridiculous. The technology alone stretches credibility. Clyde's resources and expertise seem nearly limitless. His timing has to be flawless, people have to behave exactly as he expects, and investigators have to conveniently overlook things until the plot's ready for them to notice. That's a lot of luck for a movie insisting it's all about genius. Once you clock that pattern, everything else starts drawing scrutiny too. A legal procedure gets strange, investigative choices feel convenient, characters materialize wherever the plot needs them, and some people make decisions that don't feel very sharp given they know exactly how far ahead Clyde can plan. You start asking questions the film really doesn't want you asking. Why would they do that? How did he know that? When did he set this up? How could that possibly work? None of it is inherently fatal. Plenty of unrealistic movies work fine, as long as they establish that heightened world from the start. If Law-Abiding Citizen had opened as a comic book-style thriller, Clyde's later schemes would probably go down much easier. But it doesn't. The opening is grounded: an ugly home invasion, courtroom frustration, a plea bargain, a man losing faith in the system. It plays like a dark, serious revenge drama. Then somewhere along the way, Clyde morphs into an almost impossible criminal mastermind who can weaponize practically anything. And that tonal shift is where the film starts fighting itself. It becomes two different movies, one about injustice, the other about an unstoppable genius toying with an entire city. Neither idea is inherently bad, the issue is they don't quite belong in the same film. The early revenge material has a personal, bitter, grounded anger to it, closer to something like Death Wish, and then the story drifts towards Saw-style territory or a heightened mastermind villain vibe reminiscent of the Joker, a completely different energy involving elaborate traps and psychological games from a villain who's prepared for every possible move. That can be fun. But the film still wants its moral argument taken with total seriousness, and that's where the friction shows. One scene wants you thinking about plea bargains and institutional failure, the next wants you marveling at Clyde's latest insane kill, then it's back to a serious conversation about justice. Then something explodes. The film keeps bouncing between those registers without ever settling on which one matters more, and eventually spectacle wins out, which costs the screenplay some of its edge, because Clyde and Nick simply talking is more compelling than Clyde blowing something up. The courtroom scenes carry more tension than a lot of the later action. The prison negotiations have more bite than another elaborate revenge device. When these two men argue, the film has something real when it's just another guess what Clyde planned this time sequence. The ideas get buried. There's also a predictability problem hiding inside the twists. The film wants to feel unpredictable, and sometimes it is. You might not know exactly how Clyde's going to strike next, but the overall structure becomes easy to read after a while. A character starts to feel safe, probably isn't. Someone questions whether the original deal was the right call. That conversation isn't going to end well. The authorities think they've cracked the plan. There's obviously another layer. The specific details can still surprise you even as the rhythm becomes predictable, and that predictability chips away at the suspense early on. Every new death expands the mystery later. Another death can feel like the same trick with a different mechanism, and that affects pacing too. People often describe this movie as fast-paced, and that's fair. There's barely a chance to settle before the next threat, investigation, or attack arrives. And for the first half especially, that momentum genuinely works. You're constantly asking what Clyde's doing and how he's doing it. But there's a different kind of pacing issue underneath. A movie can be packed with events and still start to feel repetitive, and that's what happens later. Once you've got Clyde's basic pattern figured out, the story has to work harder to surprise you. So everything scales up. Bigger plans, higher stakes, more desperate authorities, and paradoxically, the film can start to feel slower, because you already know the rhythm. Another plan, another reaction, another reveal that Clyde was already ahead of them, another scramble to catch up. You're still watching, but the surprise isn't quite the same. By the final act, the plot gets especially tangled. So much energy goes into explaining how Clyde's been operating, what he prepared, what the authorities finally uncover, and how they plan to counter him, that the clean moral conflict from the opening nearly disappears. That's unfortunate, because the film never needed to get more complicated to become more interesting and already had the compelling part. Clyde versus Nick, personal revenge versus legal justice, a prosecutor forced to examine the compromises his career was built on, a victim slowly becoming worse than the system he claims to despise. That's enough on its own. You don't need to keep stacking twists on top of it. Sometimes the script seems to confuse complication with intelligence. A plan isn't automatically brilliant just because it has a dozen moving parts. Sometimes a dozen moving parts just give the audience a dozen chances to spot something that doesn't add up, and by the end, law-abiding citizen hands out plenty of those chances. What's strange is I still enjoy a lot of it. That's what makes the film so frustrating. Even once I stop buying the mechanics, I still want to see what Clyde does next. Even when the script overreaches, there's enough conviction in the setup to keep pulling you forward, and every so often the film circles back to its original idea and reminds you how much better it could have been. A line between Clyde and Nick, a moment about the justice system, a reminder that all of this started because one man decided a conviction mattered more than the victim's sense of justice, and then it's back to the gadgets. That's the screenplay in miniature. A genuinely strong idea, several clever moments, plenty of entertainment, and nowhere near enough restraint. If Clyde had stayed brilliant but believable, the film would have been far scarier. If the revenge had stayed personal a little longer, it would have carried more emotional weight. If the story had trusted its moral conflict instead of constantly escalating the spectacle, it might have actually delivered on what that first act promised. Instead, It keeps making itself bigger until it becomes less convincing, and that's the irony. The more elaborate Clyde's plan gets, the less intelligent the film starts to feel. The ending is where the movie loses me most, not because I wanted Clyde to win, and not because I wanted Nick to lose, but because after spending so much time building this layered argument about justice, compromise, revenge, and institutional failure, the film takes the easiest exit available when it's finally time to resolve it all. For most of the runtime, Clyde feels nearly impossible to stop. Every time the authorities think they've caught up, he's already somewhere ahead of them, sometimes absurdly so. So when the final confrontation arrives, you expect a resolution that matches that level of cunning. Instead, it feels surprisingly simple, almost too simple, and because the film has worked so hard to convince us Clyde accounts for everything, the way he finally gets outmaneuvered raises an uncomfortable question. Not how did Nick finally win, but wait, Clyde didn't see that coming? That's not a great question to be asking in the last 10 minutes of a film built entirely around an obsessive mastermind. The climax is also far more conventional than the rest of the story wants to be. By this point, the film has raised genuinely uncomfortable questions. What happens when the justice system prioritizes conviction statistics over moral outcomes? How much compromise is too much? When does revenge stop being understandable and become pure destruction? Does Nick actually learn anything? Has the system changed at all? Instead of really engaging with any of it, the movie opts for urgency, danger, and an explosive finish, which is a little disappointing, because the film's best scenes were never really about explosions, they were about arguments. Clyde dismantling legal procedure in court, Nick trying to justify the deal he made, Clyde explaining that this stopped being about revenge a long time ago. Those scenes had real tension because the characters were actually challenging each other. The ending gives us closure, but closure isn't the same as resolution. Clyde is stopped, the immediate threat is neutralized, Nick survives. Fine. But what actually changed? That's where the film goes strangely quiet. The justice system that created Clyde's rage is still there. The culture of plea bargains is still there. Nick's obsession with winning cases has been challenged, but the film doesn't spend enough time showing what that actually means for him going forward. The institutional problem was massive when the story needed it to motivate Clyde. By the end, it nearly vanishes, which makes the conclusion feel thematically smaller than the film that preceded it. There's almost a sense that once Clyde's gone, everything can just return to normal. But wasn't the entire point that normal was part of the problem? That's the contradiction at the heart of it. Clyde becomes monstrous and no argument there. He crosses too many lines, kills people uninvolved in his family's death, and turns personal grief into a war on an entire institution. He has to be stopped. But stopping Clyde doesn't automatically prove the system was right, and the film never quite figures out how to hold both ideas at once. So it picks one: Clyde went too far, end of story. Except that's not really the end of the argument. The original plea deal still feels wrong, Nick's reasoning still feels compromised, and the system still produced the exact situation that shattered Clyde's faith in it. The film never really answers that. And maybe it doesn't have to. Some films are better for leaving moral questions open, but there's a difference between deliberately leaving something unresolved and simply moving past it, and here it feels like the latter. The film raises the questions, then gets distracted by the mechanics of stopping Clyde, which is why the ending can feel oddly anticlimactic even with so much technically happening. The stakes are big, the danger is real, the pace never lets up. But the most interesting part of the story has already been left behind. There's also an odd final emotional beat. After 2 hours in this dark, bitter, violent world, the film suddenly offers something much softer and more sentimental. I understand the intent. Nick's been through hell, confronted his own choices, and is trying to reconnect with the parts of his life that matter outside a courtroom. Conceptually that tracks, but tonally it feels almost too clean. Like the film is trying to reassure the audience after spending 2 hours making everything messy. And this isn't really a reassuring movie. It's angry and cynical for most of its runtime, insisting that legal institutions are flawed, people are morally inconsistent, and revenge can turn a victim into something terrifying. Then suddenly there's this tidy emotional bow at the end, as if someone wanted audiences leaving the theater feeling a little better. I'm not convinced the film earned that. That ending is probably a big reason reactions to this movie are so split. Some people genuinely dislike it at the plot holes, Clyde's impossible planning, the exaggerated violence, the legal shortcuts, some of the character choices, and especially that final stretch, all read as ridiculous to them, and that's a fair reaction. If credibility is what you need most from a thriller, this film will test your patience badly. It asks you to accept things that are genuinely hard to defend, and the more you think about Clyde's plans afterward, the more holes appear. Then there's the other side. Plenty of people love this movie, and I get that too, because when it's clicking, it's incredibly watchable. It has anger, energy, a genuinely strong lead performance from Gerard Butler, and that satisfying cat-and-mouse structure that keeps you waiting for the next reveal. It delivers revenge fantasy, courtroom drama, brutal action, moral debate, and the ongoing question of whether Clyde is completely wrong or simply out of control. That combination is hard to resist, and it explains why critical reception and audience reaction can diverge so sharply. You can sit down and pick apart the screenplay and find problems everywhere, but films aren't experienced purely as screenplays. Sometimes a movie works because of momentum, attitude, a performance, or a single scene so entertaining you forgive the logic gaps until the next one arrives. This film has plenty of that, and Gerard Butler in particular does an enormous amount of heavy lifting. Even when Clyde becomes almost impossible to believe, Butler keeps him magnetic. You want to know what he'll do next, what he'll say next, and there's a real pleasure in watching everyone around him realize they underestimated him. Which brings us to the film's biggest strength and biggest weakness at once. Clyde is more compelling than the movie's argument against him. That's a problem, because the film clearly wants us to recognize that he's gone too far, but it's spent so much time making him the smartest, most magnetic, most active presence in the story that fully turning the audience against him becomes genuinely difficult. Nick is meant to be his lawful counterweight, but he never carries quite the same dramatic force. The system is supposed to be the thing worth defending, yet the film's own opening spends its time showing us exactly why Clyde stopped believing in it. So by the time the resolution arrives, the movie is trying to close an argument it never actually balanced, and that's why the ending feels less satisfying than it should. Still, I wouldn't call Law-Abiding Citizen a failure. Not close. It's flawed, certainly, occasionally ridiculous, definitely, and it becomes too tangled for its own good, pushing Clyde's abilities well past believability, losing some of its moral clarity, and settling for an ending that feels safer and more conventional than its setup deserved. But there's too much working here to write it off entirely. The premise is strong, the first half is genuinely gripping, the Clyde-Nick dynamic carries real tension, the revenge sequences are memorable, and the film asks questions worth asking even if it doesn't always know what to do with them. That's probably why people are still talking about it, not because it perfectly untangles the meaning of justice, because it doesn't, and not because the plot holds up under scrutiny, because it definitely doesn't, but because it taps into something genuinely uncomfortable, the feeling that a system can technically function and still feel completely wrong. That revenge can feel satisfying long after it's stopped being defensible. That a victim can turn into the villain without making everyone who failed him innocent by comparison. Those are good ideas, messy, but good.